I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you a few thoughts. Um, we're not able to do it in person, but technology allows us this opportunity to do it remotely. And I suppose we should be thankful that technology and in particular digital technology can, at least from time to time, be put to some good use. And Zoom has been a very useful avenue, platform for doing just that for many, many people all over the world. Well, we certainly, as we all know, live in very uncertain times. And for many, not least in Australia, COVID-19 is at the moment at the center of that uncertainty. Uncertainty about what the future may have in store for us. Of course, to some considerable extent, the future is what we collectively decide to make it. And that's really the central issue I want to address this afternoon. And if you'll allow me, I want to start at the deep end. What is COVID-19? Well, it is first and foremost a phenomenon that is global. And that tells us a lot about the world in which we live. Of course, it has local dimensions, it has national dimensions, but essentially it's a global phenomenon. There are no boundaries to it. Which reminds us, of course, of some other problems on the horizon which are equally global. It has a lot to do with the social and economic arrangements that are part and parcel of our condition at this time in history. It has a lot to do with our decision-making processes, with our institutions. And the point I want to make, the principal point, is that it is a symptom of a much deeper ailment. Yes, it is, of course, a medical challenge, a health challenge we need to address. But that challenge is just a signal. A signal, I think, that our social economic arrangements, our decision-making processes, and our institutions are basically not fit for purpose. They are not fit for purpose. How to remedy this ailment, the deeper ailment that I'm going to try and illustrate through COVID-19 is, I put it to you, the defining ethical issue of our time. It's not climate change, it's not COVID-19, it's not nuclear weapons, it's all of those things, but it is the interconnection between them. And of course, if I may begin by making this point, this is not the first pandemic. Over the last 100 or so years, we have had a number of them. Of course, going back to the Spanish flu, 500 million cases of infections, 50 million deaths, give or take. And since the Second World War, we've had the Asian flu, 1957, more than 1 million deaths. The Hong Kong flu, 1968, 1 million deaths again, 100,000 of those in the United States. More recently, 2009, we had the swine flu. There were 60 million cases in the United States, 270 odd people hospitalized, and 12,000 deaths. More than 100,000 deaths worldwide. And over the last 20 years, we've had the likes of SARS, Ebola, MERS, avian flu, and much else. And with each one of those, none can be said to have been totally stamped out and eliminated. There is a lingering threat which periodically the World Health Organization acknowledges. So what can we say about COVID-19? It's not the first pandemic, and almost certainly it won't be the last. There is more to come, I regret to have to say, at least based on the evidence at our disposal. So what are some of the observations we can make about where we're up to, or where we're up to at this point in time? What is it, if we're going to learn some lessons which can help us in the future, what is it that we can say about the way we have been handling COVID-19 around the world? Well, the first thing to say is how unready and unprepared the world has been, in spite of this recurrence of epidemics and pandemics for the last 100 years. It's as if after each one, and particularly after the last half a dozen, on each occasion, we wanted to forget it, to believe that it was gone, never to return. Not only that particular pandemic, but any others that would follow. And so there were no national plans by and large. What was Australia's national plan for a pandemic? So the responses have been ad hoc, trying to learn as best we can while working on each development. This was not cumulative knowledge or wisdom. And some of those that were health authorities, including the World Health Organization, that were repositories of wisdom and some knowledge, including some national health authorities, were completely disregarded. If we think of the English-speaking world, there are probably two, the US and the UK, whose performance has been nothing short of appalling. Appalling. Paid no attention, not just to what had happened before with pandemics, but no attention to the advice that was being given here and now for this particular one. Fortunately for us, Australia and New Zealand within the English-speaking world did much better. And New Zealand better than Australia. So the international response has not been a good one. Why? Because our institutions are not up to the task of performing well in these circumstances. We know, for example, that the main international body created to assist the international community, the World Health Organization, was systematically disregarded by many national governments. And we know that it was subjected to criticism at a time when everything possible should have been done to increase its resources so that it could act more effectively than it does. The World Health Organization's budget, annual budget, which is meant to look after the global health of the entire international community, is less than Victoria's health budget. And at this time, some countries took it upon themselves to make the World Health Organization a pawn in their rivalry, namely, in particular, China and the United States. That's the best we can say about what was done. The worst is that the US administration decided to make it a scapegoat for its own abject incompetence. And the people of the United States are now paying the very heavy price. But even in Europe, which has much better established institutional arrangements for cooperation, I think you will all know this case, or perhaps have heard about it, that Italy, which was the first country to really experience, a European country, to experience the brunt, the earliest case, once the pandemic had set in, the Prime Minister, the Italian Prime Minister, wrote to all his European colleagues and asked for assistance. And for weeks, not one of them bothered to reply. That's inside the European Union. So you can imagine, of course, they have now agreed to a COVID-19 package, but that has come well after 3 months after the pandemic got going in earnest in Western Europe, Western and Central Europe. So our institutions for international consultation and collaboration, and our national institutions in terms of national planning to deal with emergencies are not really up to the mark. They are way, way short of what one would want them to be able to do. And so, while we want to respond, of course, to the challenge of the current pandemic, we have to be looking at the much larger picture. What will we do to improve dramatically the quality of our institutions, national, regional, and global? And unfortunately, so far, including in Australia, very little attention has been paid to this. I don't think we've heard a prime minister or a state premier announcing that proper planning processes will be gradually put in place in order to deal with the next emergency. No one's even talking about it very much in our media. So there's a long way to go. The second thing that has come through very clearly is that there is a shift going on in the world in what I would call the center of gravity. What do I mean by that? Well, it's very interesting to compare. The shift is, of course, from west to east. What I want to suggest, I don't have time to develop this in any detail, the shift is momentous and it's irreversible. It is irreversible as far as one can see into the future. I'm not saying irreversible in 500 years' time, but irreversible for the time being. So what have we seen with COVID-19? Well, we know it started off in China. Well, at least that's the current consensus. We may find out eventually that it may have started even somewhere else. There's a research is still going on, but the consensus at the moment is it started in China. And yes, the local authorities, which is the equivalent of our state governments, when it happened in the province of Hubei, tried to cover it up, partly because they were uncertain as to what was in store and did not want to admit to any incompetence on their part. And therefore, it took a little while for the central government to understand the dimension of the problem. Eventually, they did. At first, the central government in China, we're talking about days now, a week or two, But when this thing gets going, a few minutes can be an eternity. So for the first week or so, probably cover up at the provincial level. Once the central government understood what was happening, they were in two minds. Would they disown the provincial government? Would they wait? They waited a little while. But sooner or later, and it was fairly soon, the health advice was irrefutable. And the central government then came down with a ton of bricks. It purged the provincial government and introduced the most draconian lockdown attempted anywhere. And within 6 weeks, it had suppressed the virus. In a population of 1.4 billion, 65 times that of Australia, the result is nothing short of remarkable. The speed with which they worked. Hospitals with 2,000 to 3,000 beds erected within 10 days. Okay. So China did something quite remarkable. I don't think it has been matched once, admittedly, it had got going. And if you look at the charts in terms of number of infections and deaths, China now appears very low down in the international ladder, though it has the world's largest population, 1.4 billion, 65 times Australia's population. But it's not just China. Malaysia has done quite well. South Korea has done quite well, despite fears of a second outbreak, as we've experienced in Australia. Vietnam has done probably best of all. East Asia. And you can't put it down to just dictatorial regimes. They're not all dictatorial. South Korea is supposed to be to have a democratic system of government. Malaysia, somewhere in between. Japan too, although Japan has had a bit of a flare up in the last little while. But still, if you look at all those countries in East Asia, they have done remarkably better than Europe and North America. Remarkably better. And that is because a very strong sense of discipline within those populations, a profound sense of collective responsibility. And once they detect authentic authority, just about everyone follows suit. So this is part of a larger shift that's taking place, where in Asia we now see economic performance of a high level, increasing technological sophistication, for better or for worse, and with that, increasing self-confidence on the world stage. And that poses huge questions for how the West is to handle this. And clearly, to call COVID-19, as the American president has done as a Chinese plague, must be the worst possible response to a phenomenon that's now emerging. But that's a huge subject to be developed perhaps at another time. The next important lesson that we've, I think, learned from COVID-19, and we're learning it in Australia, is, of course, that while it is a health problem, it's also an economic problem, right? And sure enough, our Prime Minister has, from very early in the piece, said that it was an economic crisis and a health crisis. So at least there was a recognition of the link between health and economy. But the way he understood it, the link between health and economy, was that health was creating, excuse me, was creating challenges, which challenges, amongst other things, and perhaps most importantly, from his point of view, for Australia's economy. These were the spin-offs, the negative spin-offs of this pandemic, that it was causing a major headache and major problems for the functioning of Australia's economy. And no doubt that's correct. But he didn't go the next step, that our economic structures, not just in Australia, but in many parts of the world, has made the pandemic much worse than it would otherwise have been. We know for a fact now, because the pandemic has been with us for several months, that there is an enormous disparity between the rich and the poor when it comes to experiencing the effects of the pandemic in many different ways. First of all, in terms of those who get infected. Those who get infected are overwhelmingly from the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. Of course, there are some who might be very wealthy who still get infected, including some who were taking part in luxury cruises and got caught in the various ships that they had used for that purpose. But by and large, the concentrations have been in places where those experiencing economic hardship or social exclusion of one kind or another, they have been at the forefront. And we see that in Australia, and of course we see it in other parts of the world, and we see it even in countries like Brazil, which has already a phenomenal number of infections. But we also know, that is to say, therefore, that tell me something about the structure of your economy, and I will tell you in advance something of the profile of the distribution of pain and suffering in your society. The other thing we've learned, of course, is the relationship to the environment. Of course, the pandemic will have an impact on the environment, but the more important lesson is that the environment and what we, the human species, have been doing to it is undoubtedly the primary cause of this and previous pandemics. The experts have been telling us for some considerable time that deforestation and encroachment on diverse wildlife habitats is helping diseases to spread from animals and to humans more frequently and with dire consequences. What they've been telling us for some time, but not too many have been listening, or not enough have been listening, is that biodiversity loss can create landscapes that increase risky human-wildlife contact, and therefore increase the chances of certain viruses, not only bacteria and parasites, spilling over into people and then mutating in ways that are very difficult to control. So a great deal will need to be done regarding our relationship to the environment, which includes loss of biodiversity, deforestation, and the use of wildlife for purely commercial purposes. These are all now questions on the table which we need to address in earnest. And as I've said, of course, it's connected to the politics. politics understood as decision making and institutions. So here is, if you like, the multifaceted ethical challenge we now face. What is that challenge as far as I can see it? It is that of acknowledging, accepting, and giving effect to the obligations we all have. Of course, as individuals, but as communities, as countries, towards one another. Obligations. And what is that overarching obligation? I think it's the overarching obligation to the common good. To the common good. To the good of humanity and the good of the Earth community more widely, which includes the other species and their habitats. And the need for a much more harmonious development, not only between peoples, but between people and nature. That is really at the heart of the pandemic crisis that we currently face, both in terms of what caused it and how might be the best way to respond to it. So what does that mean? I think it means that citizens everywhere, of course in Australia, because that's where we are living, that's where the, if you like, the issues come within our sphere of influence, citizens must, to put it generally, reclaim the commons. We must reclaim the commons. We must reclaim that which ought to be the public sphere as a people, as citizens. That is to say, we must subject our own decision-making processes, our policies certainly, but importantly our institutions, to very, very careful scrutiny. And where these are found wanting, we must be able to engage in deliberation, reflection, and conversation with our fellow citizens about different ways of responding, different ways of reaching decisions, different ways of interacting, different expectations of how our social, economic, and environmental arrangements, as well as health arrangements, will be organized in the time ahead. And we've got to do it in active consultation with other countries. And I just want to finish on this point. Active consultation with and collaboration, but understanding that in this age, the technological age of digital communication, it is open to all of us to be in touch with people who are also sharing these concerns in other places and other countries. In other words, I'm trying to get away from the idea that it's government. Things go wrong and you say, oh, how awful the government. Well, it might be awful. It might be. But you have to ask the question, what is it the citizen can do? And the citizen or the citizenry has, I think, an ethical obligation to put certain big ethical challenges on the table and to insist that they be acknowledged, recognized, and acted upon. And maybe the pandemic has a silver lining to it if it helps at least a number of citizens, us included, to give much more serious thought to some of these larger questions, which really are pointing to an interdependent set of conditions that is part of everyday life in today's world. How we can be citizens not only of our country, which we ought to be effective, responsible citizens, but effective, responsible citizens of the world and of the Earth community as a whole. If there is one message, that important message that the pandemic is sharing with us, I think it is that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Very challenging stuff that you're putting out there for us. Let me ask a question or make a comment that you might wish to respond to. You talk about reclaiming the common good by the citizenry of the world. What do you say, though, when you look at the projections that have been quoted quite freely in the media of recent times, and that in the next 40 years, we're going to see something like another 2 billion people added to the current 7 point something or other billion that currently inhabit the planet. How do we deal with a challenge like that, if that's the right word for it, particularly when the larger concentration of this population increase is going to occur in places like Africa, in particular, places which are not really renowned for their governance or the capability or the because of the deprivation in which many of them live, haven't really been very effective in being able to cope with these sorts of issues in the past.
Well, that's a very big question, of course, and a very challenging and important one. I think if you're worrying about this, and it is a legitimate area of concern, there's only one way of handling it, from a historical experience. Where has population stabilized, in what parts of the world, and in some cases even we see early signs of an initial decline of population. Where is that happening? It is happening in those places where there is a reasonable standard of living. That's inevitably accompanied by smaller families. And this is something that China is experiencing. In fact, it is now projected that China should expect a declining population over the next 20 years. Japan has had a declining population for some time. Russia has a declining population. Now, Africa does not. That's true. And parts of Latin America do not. So, if the world was serious about the population problem, it would be at the same time serious about the development problem. And we've had the Millennium Development Goals, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're just hearing from the United Nations that the pandemic risks undoing 20 years worth of developmental efforts around the world. And therefore, the implication of this is we need to prevent this undoing of whatever bits of good work have been done so far, and to greatly extend our efforts to collectively, internationally, to raise the living conditions of the poorest and the most vulnerable in various parts of Africa, Middle East, and Latin America, which is where the main concentrations are. And that's really an obligation on the part of the more prosperous sectors of the world, which of course now includes China more and more, but the West as a whole as well. So, yes, there are obligations, but there is no way you can deal with the population problem by some kind of global edict, which you then implement by use of the military or police forces. It just won't work. You have to bring about the social and economic conditions which lead to smaller families than is the current practice in certain parts of the underdeveloped world.
Good. And another point, which is somewhat connected, you talked about the movement from the West back to the East in terms of influence and growth and so forth. Instead of talking about it just being a move like that, it might really be a return to the past when, if you go back 400 years or so, the portion of the world economy is estimated to have been made, even in those days, that China was probably 25% of the world's economy, and India, some large percentage also, taking the two of those countries to around 50% of the world's economy.
Yeah.
So perhaps this is one of those things that's inevitable, that as these China, India shake off the restraints of colonization, that it was inevitable that to happen, and it's going to happen anyway.
Yes, I think you're right. When I say a shift from what has been the experience of the world for the last 200 to 300 years in particular. But you're absolutely right. We are going back to an earlier period when the center of economic gravity, if you like to put it that way, was very much in Asia. And some of them will tell you, many of them will tell you, our Asian friends, that it's back to normal. Back to normal, they say. The last 300 years have been abnormal. And now we're back to normal. And of course, some in the West don't feel very comfortable about going back to that kind of normal. They like to think that the last 200 years should be regarded as normal. And that's one of the major problems we currently face. Whether the West generally, the United States in particular, as the most significant, the most powerful country within the West, is willing to accommodate a shift that is unstoppable, and to find creative ways of doing it together with others in ways that would benefit the international community as a whole. But you can see that the pandemic has exposed the problem, that at the moment we do not have effective ways in which the one that's declining and the one that's coming up, we do not have effective ways in which they can communicate in ways that are creative and constructive. And by the way, I know this is going a little bit outside, but not entirely, our theme. Unfortunately, Australia is not playing a positive role. It could do so much as an independent middle power, suggesting, advocating, not on its own, but with other like-minded states, including the Malaysias and Indonesias of this world, to remind the great powers, the declining ones and the ascending ones, that we need confidence building, trust building measures, and not animosities and rhetoric which really advance nobody's interests, let alone the world's interests. And Australia could be playing a useful role together with others. But we know that the moment the United States became critical of the WHO, not before, but immediately after, Australia added its voice to that. And the directive came, why don't you, Australia, call for an international inquiry? And Australia said, of course we will. And within a week, within a few days, less than a week, Australia was doing just that. Not in a constructive way, let's evaluate how we're all performing, the WHO included, and let's see how we can improve our international arrangements for greater cooperation and collaboration. And unfortunately, that's not what we did. And if I may, to add one more little bit of information. And contrary to what government is claiming, we did not get an inquiry. We did not. We got an evaluation. That's the word that was agreed to. It was not the result of Australia's doing. The agreement was set on its path by the European Union, using much more moderate language and making it clear that the evaluation that is to take place, and it's now going to be headed by two people, one of which is the former New Zealand Prime Minister. This evaluation is going to be an evaluation not just of the WHO's performance, but of every government in the world, including the United States. That's what Australian government does not want you to know. It was a flop, a complete flop. And all it has done is incurred China's hostility. And the same result would have been achieved if Australia had done nothing at all. There would have still been an evaluation, as is the one that's now about to get underway. So let's hope it's a useful, constructive evaluation, and all the weaknesses of the world's response come to light, and practical recommendations are made, which we can then all act upon. We'll have to wait and see.
In the same, somewhat similar vein, you talk about reclaiming the commons. The question here has come in about reclaiming the commons. What do you mean? Would you like to expand more on that?
Yes. That's a term that came into vogue, let's say, about 30 or 40 years ago, and it's had its ups and downs within the literature. What's meant, basically, is this: that the entire world and its resources are not there for the private gain or the private interest of any individual or group of people. That it's there for the benefit of humanity as a whole, and in some harmonious relationship with other species and their habitats on which we depend. So, in other words, everything that exists on this planet, and perhaps beyond, is held in common by all of us jointly. And we should be making sure that all the resources of the commons are used for the common good. It is something, this is what the argument is, that humanity has let go. And we have allowed, in many different parts of the world, for what is done to the commons to be made by a handful of people, the rich and the powerful, for their benefit. It is time, the argument goes, for concerned people the world over to reclaim the commons, to reclaim that it is their responsibility to take care of the commons for the common good, all that which we hold in common. And it's not there to enable small groups of people, individuals, small groups, corporations, governments, military regimes to amass power and wealth at the expense of the common good, the good of the commons as a whole. Um, and the commons is contrasted with another term, and I mention it so that it's familiar to you, enclosure. So those who are not comfortable with the notion of the commons to be held jointly by all of humanity for the benefit of humanity, like to enclose it. And if you like, private control, whether it's based on wealth or power or military force, is used to enclose parts of the earth for gain, whether it be economic gain or political gain. In other words, including a few at the expense of the many. So reclaiming the commons is an attempt to capture in a slogan the need to depart from this way of organizing our world in the 21st century.
There's a question here from the Reverend Dr. Margaret Mayman, which I think follows on from your response to the previous question. What sort of social fora or institutions do you think are needed to facilitate an increase in citizens' participation in the public sphere? At present, we don't deliberate and make decisions. Instead, we debate them from our silos.
Yes. Well, in an ideal world, and of course we don't live in an ideal world, but in an ideal world, our political institutions, I call them political, our institutions, which includes governments and parliaments and political parties and all the other bits and pieces that make up our system, would be committed to engaging in a process of wide-ranging consultation with the community at large on all the major issues and challenges we face. And this would be funded, resourced, structurally and organizationally and financially. It would be resourced, and it would be something constant. And of course, the focus would be both on short-term issues and problems, but also on medium and longer term. And this would be part of an ongoing educational program. Now, that's in an ideal world, and clearly we don't have that. So in the absence of that, I think what's required is for civil society, not waiting for the lead to come from government. If it comes, wonderful, but if it doesn't, we are not paralyzed. And to try and establish platforms, fora of all kinds, which are able to do this. And obviously, your network is just one such example, but there are many others, with the added, if you like, qualification that none of these should operate as silos, that as far as possible, they should be in touch and open to the work of other similar groups in the community, and there should be linkages over time. So that's something which civil society then would initiate. But having said that, there is another critical area, and that is our educational institutions. And unfortunately, they are dreadful, dreadful. I've been in the educational system, well, virtually all my life. And they are dreadful in terms of instilling and equipping all the people that go through the formal educational process, from primary and even earlier, right through to university, instilling a capacity, the skills, the aptitudes, the ways of seeing the world that would enable this process of deliberation and reflection and discussion and consultation to take place. And where it does not exist, for people to be able to know how to take the initiative and help make it happen. Now, that's something that, of course, those who are in control of educational institutions should be paying attention to. Those who are teachers in educational institutions should be paying attention to. But I think it goes way beyond that. It goes to the responsibility of parents. Is my son or daughter going to primary school, secondary school, university, or wherever, getting the kind of education which equips him or her for a constructive, creative contribution to the globalized world in which we live? And if not, and I'm a parent, what will I do about it? Will I talk to other parents about it who might feel similarly? Yes, and educational institutions, and everyone sooner or later has some connection with an educational institution. We could be doing a lot more on that. And then, of course, the professions are so important. And each profession, whether it's the medical, the legal, architecture, whichever profession one thinks of, there are so many links of each of the main professions, social work, of course, teaching. There's so many links that each profession has to these concerns about what constitutes the common good. And it should be critical part of professional development that this be fully integrated. So there are many things that can and should be done, ideally with the blessing and involvement and financial support of government. But where it is absent, there is still much that we could be doing as civil society in our various settings and contexts and networks.
A comment here from Dr. Helen Hill. Global civil society has already been doing this, Joe, for some time, but Australia is a bit left out. We don't even use that term in most sectors in Australia. Churches in other countries play a key role.
Yes. Well, I don't know where you'd put Australia in the ladder of civil society engagement. I don't think we'd be in the forefront. We're probably not at the bottom of the ladder. But yes, we need to do much better. And it's interesting that certainly the United Nations is now paying a lot more attention to civil society, consults very widely with civil society organizations around the world on all the major issues, including health issues, pandemics, and everything else. But national governments are often less inclined to do that. So, just to illustrate, when there are international negotiations, let's say climate change, some forward-looking governments in their delegations will include representatives from civil society who play a key role in shaping and defining and articulating what the government's position would be in the negotiations, both before the actual negotiation and in the course of the negotiation. Australia has been very slow to do that, to integrate civil society into the way governments interact with other governments. Our government interacts with other governments on important issues of health, climate change, environment more generally, and economic decision making and so on. We do a little bit, but nowhere near enough. But the message that I suppose I'm trying to convey is where government is a laggard, then it's up to civil society to make its voice heard and say, we find that unacceptable. Our voices must be heard and integrated into what governments think and decide and do.
Yes. The question here specifically about America. rather challenging one, provocative one. Do you think America is moving towards another civil war?
Well, we have even now we have some obvious hostilities, which involve the forces of law and order against a number of protests taking place in different parts of the United States, which is not something entirely new. I don't think there will be an all-out civil war in the United States. It's probably being aggravated at the moment because of the president's particular personality. Um, but I think it is a highly polarized society. There's no question about that. It's one of the most polarized societies in the world. Um, and that makes it very difficult for that society to function not just harmoniously, but to function effectively. And I can't see that being remedied anytime soon. And unfortunately, it is part of America's decline that it's no longer got that sense of cohesion and in unity of understanding and communication within itself. And I think that's now going to, it's been exacerbated by the current presidency, but it's been there for some time. And I think it's likely to get worse before it gets any better. But I don't think there'll be lots and lots of people shooting each other in the streets. There will remain isolated instances, but not a fully fledged civil conflict.
Yes, my own observation from visiting the United States very often in my professional life is that there is no such thing as the United States. There are several United States, so maybe 5 or 6. There's New York, for instance, which is just New York. There's California, the West Coast. There's the South, or epitomized by Texas and Florida. And then there's the mountain central region and the Midwest. And they're all different, quite different, almost different countries. And amazing that it's had the cohesion that it seems to have had in the last 150 years or so. That's just an observation from me. I don't expect a response from them. Yes. Just a question about here in Australia. The Australian government of both parties marginalises civil society by insisting it be referred to as charities and not-for-profits. It's very hard for advocacies, civil society organisations to get legitimacy, or professional organisations perhaps can get a footing. If you'd like to make any sort of a comment on that, Joe, that'd be welcome.
Well, I agree with the sentiment of the question of the observation, but I suppose my response is legitimacy is not bestowed by government. Legitimacy is bestowed by civil society. I think this is the important mindset we all need to cultivate. It is we, civil society, the community, that bestows legitimacy on government. And when government doesn't act as it should, we are able to, if you like, call into question the legitimacy of government, if that is the position, the standpoint of the people after deliberation. So I think we need to remind ourselves that and we're supposed to be a democracy, though admittedly, often more in the breach than the observance. But in a democracy, it's the people, the civil society, the community that is the source of all legitimacy. And when government is not amenable, then that's reason for civil society in its parts, but hopefully as many of the parts engaged in conversation with each other, making it known that they're not going to accept that as legitimate behavior on the part of government. Of course, there are many issues. What happens when your organization happens to get government funding? Will that be an issue? And if you speak out too much, might the funding not be cut? Etc., etc., etc. So there are many, many issues, and that includes, let's say, religious organizations, the funding of non-government schools, and so on. And so there are large questions which must themselves become the subject of serious discussion, I hope, in the years to come.
Good. Well, perhaps one last question to give you a break. But from Eric and Margaret Smith, Joe, what sustains you on the face of all these massive issues? What gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope, and I'm glad it's been put in those words, because I'm neither pessimistic nor am I optimistic. I think both of them are serious errors of judgment. I don't believe things will work out for the best just by magic, nor do I think they will necessarily end in unmitigated catastrophe, as if we were predestined for that kind. I think it's what we make it. And what gives me hope is the enormous effort that not hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands, but millions of people around the world are putting into coming to terms with the world in which we live and all its problems and the fast changes that are occurring, and putting a lot of effort and sacrificing a lot in order to be able to rise to the challenge. And you know, I know that the challenge is enormous, and it does require for this species, our species, to rise a notch or two in terms of ethical awareness and ethical competence. But I think that is within our capacity to do so. And the question is whether enough people will rise to the challenge. So I see lots of people doing absolutely wonderful things. And the more one is in touch with them, whichever way one does that, the more one's in touch with such people, the more one's hope in the future is strengthened. But there's no guarantee of success. We just have to work very hard and hope that the collective effort will be equal to the challenge, but time will tell.
Thank you very much, Joe. On behalf of everybody, I do thank you for challenging us in the way in which you have this afternoon. It's something I think that we all would agree is the issues that we must address if humanity is to have a sustainable future. And you put us to the test and given us much to think about. I'd ask everybody to use the reactions button, which you can find down in the bottom pop-up toolbar, to show your appreciation of what Joe has done for us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you, Joe. You're welcome with us anytime, might I say, too. Thank you.
Look forward to joining you in the future.
Thank you very much. Before we close, just a statement about
Margaret, the city church. Do you think?
the August meeting.
He's a member of East Malvern.
Oh.
Stonington.
Oh.
The comment about the August meeting. On Sunday 23rd, another Zoom meeting, and in fact, I think for the foreseeable future, we can look forward to our meetings being by Zoom, which have proved to be a very effective way of giving greater intimacy, I think, to our discussions. But our speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Christopher Page, and his topic will be enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment, directions towards the future of Christian faith, influenced by theologian John D. Caputo, a significant member of the Westar Institute and the Jesus Seminar, and also process theology and Irish philosopher and poet, the late John O'Donoghue. So that will be an interesting, again, an interactive type of presentation and discussion. So I look forward to your joining us 23rd of August, same time, 4 p.m. There will, of course, be an invitation passed around to give you details about how to log in and other information about the meeting. So thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Oh, well.
Cheerio.